And I am going to, I know it's 4 o'clock, I'm going to give people a couple more minutes. I had about 25 people sign up for today's session, so I am going to give people some more time to log in. But in the meantime, if you all would like to go ahead and either unmute yourself and share out where you're from, what the community organization is that you're coming from, or please feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat as well and introduce yourself. And while you all are doing that, introducing yourselves in the chat, I am going to keep letting people in. And I'll probably give people until 4:05 or so. So again, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, put the organization you are joining us from, your role. Yes, welcome, Sarah. All right, and for those of you just joining, welcome. It looks like it's probably going to be a smaller group today, but please feel free to put your information in the chat, your position, where you're joining us from. Awesome, welcome Sarah, Melanie, behavior specialist, Rebecca from Pierce County Juvenile Court. Welcome. Rebecca, as of yesterday, I just started working and doing some consulting with Echo Glen Children's Center, which I'm really excited about. I'll give us about 2 more minutes and then I will get started for today's session. I know I sound like a broken record for people that have been here for a couple minutes, but if you are just joining us, please feel free to put your information in the chat, where you are joining us from, your role. So we get to know who the audience is today. Make sure I'm speaking to you all. Awesome, welcome Chris, Youth and Family Support. Welcome everybody. Awesome, welcome Wendy. Hi, Ms. Daly.
Hi, Tovah.
Hey, how are you?
Good.
Good. Awesome, welcome Michelle, special education teacher. We got one more person joining and then I'm gonna get us started. And there was a couple people that had emailed me saying that they were not going to be able to make it to today's session just because of illness. So I am recording today's session. And it's 4:05, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So my name is Tovah Denaro. I am an education and behavioral consultant, and I work all across Washington State, as well as in Northern California, really supporting predominantly school systems with trauma-informed multi-tiered systems of support. But I also work in court systems. I work with Head Start and ECAT programming. I work within different juvenile settings. I work as well with Mary Bridge Children's Hospital through Kids Mental Health Pierce County. So I'm the education consultant at Mary Bridge for Youth Engagement Services. And today, what we are really focusing on and talking about is that brain development and how structure and predictability supports our brain development, specifically when we are talking about the youth that we serve. I know a lot of you are joining today from different areas, from Tacoma Police Department, from school systems, library systems, and so welcome. This information is definitely for all of you in this session today, but please feel free if you do have any questions that is very specific to your line of work. Do not hesitate to ask. This is a small group today. Feel free to unmute yourself or just type it in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat for today's session. Today, we are going to be learning about different strategies for developing and really fine-tuning our structures and systems to support brain development of youth. We're going to understand and learn about the different parts of our brain and how they are impacted under chronic and/or extreme trauma. And we're going to reflect on using the implementation of a variety of different structures in a variety of different environments. And if you have participated in sessions with me before, some of this might be a little bit of a repeat for you. The first couple of slides, I'm really going to dive into the data, what we know about supporting youth who are exposed to chronic stress and trauma. And I always like to start with the definition so we're all on the same page when I'm talking about trauma. It's that response to a negative external event or a series of events which surpasses a child's ordinary coping skills. And we know that trauma comes in a whole bunch of different forms, right? We know maltreatment, witnessing violence, the loss of a loved one. Oftentimes, what we don't talk about, though, is how these traumatic experiences impact our brain development. They impact our behavior, and this can be inside and outside of a classroom or a work setting. And we also know that, particularly in education, 1 in 4 youth attending public school has been exposed to a traumatic event. And this can affect their learning, this can affect their behavior. We know it also impacts school performance. It also impacts memory attention, cognition. It interferes with problem solving. Youth impacted by trauma often experience forms of physical and emotional distress. And as we know, oftentimes big labels get put on young kiddos who have had an experience with trauma, who have been impacted by trauma. And youth who have experienced trauma often fall into this cycle of trauma. And so we really need to understand this cycle of trauma when we are working with youth, when we are working with individuals under the age of 25. And to understand the cycle of trauma, it's really when youth may display a problem behavior related to a past trauma, and then they become re-traumatized through punishment for those behaviors, right? So what this looks like is the youth has experienced a traumatic event. This leads them to having emotional and psychological damage, which oftentimes can lead to behavioral problems. Behavioral problems, as we know, often leads to punishment. I was just telling some of you earlier, but I just started working yesterday in Echo Glen Children's Center, right? This is the medium maximum security juvenile prison for boys and girls in Washington State. And they're in there as punishment, right? They had a behavioral problem outside of Echo Glen that led them to their punishment of being in Echo Glen, right? Oftentimes these punishments just continue this cycle, right? And this happens in school settings, but it happens outside of school settings as well. It happens in homes as well. Oftentimes there are certain cues to when we need to have our trauma-sensitive lens on when working with youth. The first one, and most obvious, is if there's a known history of traumatizing events that have happened to the youth. It's also possible that we might see some behavioral responses that are disproportionately intense given the trigger, right? Youth get way more upset than what we would expect is typical behavior for the incident. We also know if we are trying to support our youth through traditional behavioral approaches and responses, it might not be successful. Efforts to teach alternative behaviors isn't working. And it's possible that rewards and consequences might trigger the behavior, right? This is for us red flags when we probably need to start supporting this youth through that trauma-sensitive lens. Also, when traditional approaches are not successful, right? And so for example, when the antecedent behavior and the patterns of behavior are really hard to identify, we do not know why the behavior is happening. We can't figure out what is occurring during the day. There's really no pattern of the behavior. And this is because the function of behavior may be neurological, which means that it's not observable. The antecedent, right, those patterns really aren't observable because it's not outcome driven. The child isn't trying to gain something or avoid something. It's really a neurological behavior. And we do have some components of trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive care that we need to be thoughtful about when working with youth who have been or who may have been exposed to trauma, right? Thinking about how are we creating a safe environment for these youth? How are we building relationships with these youth? And how are we supporting and teaching emotional regulation? And all three of these have to be working together in order for us to be supporting the youth. And one of the things that I do when I am supporting a school district or a school building, and they have a youth with some pretty extreme or really challenging behaviors, and the youth is escalated in the moment, and one of the first things that the principal or the individual is going to have me do is go and de-escalate the kid. And I have never met this kid in my life, right? I do not have a relationship with the child. So oftentimes in that moment, it's going to be extremely challenging for me as an individual who does not know the student, doesn't know their motivators or their triggers, to support with a de-escalation because I don't have that connectedness to them yet. And so we're going to move into really understanding how all of this has to do with the brain, right? Where does our brain serve when we are seeing the world through traumatic experiences or one significant traumatic event? So we have three main areas of the brain. We have our reptilian brain, which is on the back and the bottom part of our brain. This is really our instinctual behavior. This is our fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And I always say that, fawn is the new F word. And fawn means that we are trying to please the threat so that we don't get, because we feel like that's the safest way to not get injured, right? Our reptilian brain is only there for our survival. So fight is when we feel like we have to literally fight the threat to survive. Flight is when we feel like we have to run away from the threat to survive. Freeze is when we determine, or our brain determines, that we physically freeze in order to survive. And fawn is when our brain determines we please in order to survive. Our reptilian brain is the first part of our brain to get fully developed, and it's fully developed in utero before we are born. We then have the limbic system, and this is our emotional brain. It's what's responsible for our emotional behavior. The limbic system is the next part of our brain to get fully developed, and this happens during puberty. So for any of you that work with middle school aged youth that are going through puberty, you know what I'm talking about when I say that they tend to see the world through an emotional lens, right? They think from their emotion before they think from fact. And it makes sense that during puberty, when our hormones are starting to develop and sometimes overdevelop for our brains, the limbic system is really firing quickly, right? And so we're very emotional during that time. And then the last part of our brain to get fully developed is our cortex. And this is our intellectual behavior, our intellectual tasks. Very specifically, our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that's right in the front, is the last part of the brain to get developed. And that gets developed when we are between the ages of 25 to 27 years old. Now, what's important for us to acknowledge is that this part of our brain, that prefrontal cortex, the last part to get developed, doesn't fully develop again until we are 25 to 27. And that's the part that's responsible for problem solving, for our impulse control, for determining what is right and what is wrong. Now, that being said, we physically, as adults supporting youth, have to be providing our youth opportunities to utilize that part of their brain, right? To utilize their thinking brain. Do that by helping them problem solve. We do that by helping talk them through reflection on behavior. We help them reflect on incidents, on things going on in the world, right? We pull them into that prefrontal cortex. Now, what's really important to acknowledge and to recognize about brain development is that when we are in our reptilian brain, meaning that we are feeling as though we have to survive from a threat, we have been significantly impacted by trauma, our limbic system doesn't work as efficiently, and our cortex, our prefrontal cortex, barely works at all. And you can see that in the brain scans to the left of this slide. As you can see, when an individual is experiencing anger, they are predominantly living in that limbic system and that reptilian brain. They're angry. When an individual experiences sadness, it's predominantly living in that limbic system, our emotional brain. Fear is almost entirely within the reptilian brain because, again, when we are experiencing fear, we are thinking about our own survival. And happiness is when our prefrontal cortex is being utilized. So truthfully, when our youth need to problem solve, they need to learn new information, they need to think about what is right and what is wrong, they have to be in their prefrontal cortex experiencing emotions such as happiness or joy or just being content in order to retain that information. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why the limbic system, and specifically I'm going to talk about the amygdala, why these areas are so important to consider when we are working with youth that are impacted by trauma. The limbic system is really that emotional part of the brain. And like I said, it's formed after birth, but it's fully developed during puberty. This is in charge of our evaluative functions. So the limbic system assigns meaning to what our body is perceiving. What feels good, what feels scary, right? The limbic system is responsible for telling our brain what our body is experiencing or perceiving. Therefore, the limbic system works really closely with the brainstem or that reptilian brain to create our emotion, and it drives the physical responses based on the emotion. So our brain first has to feel fear, and then our reptilian brain, that brainstem, kicks in to have a physical response of that fear. Now, the limbic system is vital in creating our memories. In fact, we have to be triggering or firing off that limbic system for us to create memories. And it's also important to know that we learn our emotions through attachments. So when we are not attaching, we are not learning emotions. And this includes the empathy, right? Experiencing what other people are experiencing. It's also really important for us to recognize the importance of attachment, especially when we are working with older kids, elementary, middle, high school age students, who maybe have not had strong attachments to adults from earlier in life, right? From birth to 4 years of age. And so I just want to show you exactly where these areas kind of sit in our brain. And so as you can see, the amygdala kind of wraps around the limbic system and is right on the edge of our reptilian brain, that brainstem, right? The amygdala, again, is responsible for storing memories, and it's responsible for telling our brain if we are scared, if we are happy, what the emotion is that our body is perceiving in order for us to determine, or for our brain to determine, whether or not we are in a dangerous situation. Now, the prefrontal cortex, which again is that frontmost part of the brain, it's just behind our eyes. This is associated with regulating our body and our emotions. It's associated with attuning to other people, being flexible. And I don't mean in like a yoga pose way. I mean being flexible with our schedules, being able to shift gears, having empathy and self-awareness, being in touch with our intuition, and losing our fears, right? If you think about it, when we are younger, we have some fears that are relatively irrational, right? The monster under the bed, wanting to sleep with the light on. As we get older and as our prefrontal cortex becomes to fully develop, these fears go away. We start to lose some of these fears. I'm still terrified of spiders though. And I just want to be clear that kids impacted by trauma have difficulty accessing this part of their brain. It becomes really challenging for kids to access this because they are living in that reptilian brain. Trauma changes our brain. It activates our brain's alarm system, and that's that amygdala that I was telling you about. The amygdala communicates through chemicals, and it really initiates this wave of neurotransmitters, which includes adrenaline to help us run or fight, which includes cortisol, which comes from the hippocampus, which I'm going to talk about. And this is rushed into our body for us to fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. We do not have control over which one of these survival methods we are choosing. Our body and our brain just does it for us. Now, the brain becomes, when an individual is impacted by regular trauma or a really significant traumatic experience, the brain actually becomes used to these chemicals. And therefore, our brain will reorganize, and it changes our brain patterns to reflect the heavy amount of cortisol and adrenaline that is rushing through our body. And when this happens, our amygdala stays activated. So our amygdala continues to trigger, it continues to fire. It's looking around essentially to determine where is the threat coming from. And the hippocampus in our brain continues to release cortisol. Cortisol actually tries to calm the brain down, but when we have so much in our body, the brain actually becomes kind of flooded essentially with cortisol. And therefore, our limbic system loses its ability to regulate emotion. In small doses, cortisol is good and necessary for our body. When our brain becomes overwhelmed by the amount of cortisol going through it, our limbic system cannot process effectively, and we are unable to regulate our emotions. And so you can see again how close the amygdala and the hippocampus are to each other. And the hippocampus, again, is responsible for distributing cortisol and adrenaline throughout our body. And when we have this excess of cortisol, there's a lot of stuff that can be impacted from this, right? Chronic fatigue, depression, decreased immune system. Some people experience sleep deprivation, migraines, tunnel vision. When we have too much cortisol that is going through our brain, this increase of stress hormone can affect us physically as well as behaviorally. When the amygdala starts to say, I'm afraid, I need help, it is going to reach out to the hippocampus, which releases this cortisol. And too much cortisol actually stores in our prefrontal cortex, so it can't regulate our fears anymore. We have a hard time determining what is a rational fear and what is an irrational fear. And some of you may have experienced this with youth before. When youth have an extreme emotional upset or an extreme escalation, and it feels like it comes out of nowhere. And that's because they have so much of this cortisol stored in their brain that they are having a hard time determining what is rational and irrational. So when this happens, the most important thing is to increase our serotonin levels. And there's a couple different ways to do this, and I'm going to go through some of it. But the best way is to be able to deep breathe for 3 minutes. Now, if you are like me, that sounds like an eternity. I am not a good example of somebody that can sit still for 3 minutes. And so you build up to it, right? And I'm telling you all this in order to determine how does this look for your youth, for the youth that you support. How can you help them start taking some deep breaths? We know that when we experience a safe environment, a calming environment, this can reduce that cortisol buildup in our brain by 50% if it's consistent within 7 to 14 days. Just having some of that consistency of safety and stability, doing daily check-ins and practicing deep breathing can help to reduce these cortisol levels. And so I mentioned that serotonin is like it's the hormone that we want to increase when we have too high of cortisol. And serotonin in our body, right, it develops naturally in our body. And some of the benefits of serotonin is it manages our sleep and our wake cycle. It balances our appetite. It controls our body temperature, our motor activity, cognitive functions, right? We need serotonin in order to access that prefrontal lobe, in order to have good problem solving, right? Making safe decisions for ourselves. And what happens when an individual is impacted by trauma as their brain is developing, right? And again, our brain is developing up until about 27 years of age. What we start to see is that we have this developmental trauma. So our brain starts to form on the triangle on the right-hand side, right? Survival is the foundation. We just need to survive. There may be some regulation and some social and emotional growth, But as you can see, cognition is the top of the triangle. Cognition is, in terms of brain development, is the least amount to get developed. That prefrontal cortex is going to be developed the least. As opposed to in typical development, like the triangle on the left, cognition, by the time we are 25 to 27 years of age, should be the most developed part of the brain. So we're going to watch a quick video to show how this comes up for youth when they are impacted by trauma.
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones. And everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stressors, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
So after watching the video and just kind of processing the information that we have just gone over, what are some of those big takeaways for you that you want to make sure that you're remembering when understanding trauma for the youth that you support? And are there any ideas that you think are critical for your community to focus on as you plan forward? So just take a minute to think and feel free to process in the chat. Yeah, that social thinning. Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate that video because it kind of says the same stuff that we're all talking about, but it puts a different spin on it as well. And I think that social thinning piece is really important to think about and to consider, because oftentimes, and especially if you work with older youth, their environment has already become so thin, right? The adults don't want to work with them anymore. It's hard for them to make friends. Their parents are frustrated with them, right? So thinking about by the time we work with them, they already don't have much trust in the world, in relationships. Yes, relationships is the intervention. That's always where I start. Absolutely. Students, especially in high school, and I work pre-K through high school, but high school is definitely like where my heart is. That's where I started my career. But now more than ever, they're feeling more and more isolated. Absolutely. And having a really hard time even knowing who to seek support from, where to go to. Absolutely. Any final thoughts or any questions that come up for you? All right. And so I just want to lay out how these survival brain, this reptilian brain methods can look for us. And this can be in any location, right? Any environment that you work with youth. And I'm focusing predominantly on those fight, flight, and freeze. And so for fight, right, the middle column of this, we know that we see acting out behavior. We see aggression sometimes, but sometimes we see youth or students that are acting silly. That hyperactivity can sometimes be a form of survival brain. When we think about flight, that running away behavior, sometimes it can simply be withdrawing, right? Refusing to answer questions, daydreaming, becoming disengaged in the conversation. And then when individuals freeze, it might look like they're just exhibiting numbness, feeling unable to move or act, refusing to answer. Exactly, that checking out to a mental safe place. And the truth is that we as adults have experienced that at some point or another, I'm sure. Right? But for youth, it becomes more and more challenging when we put different expectations on them that they don't necessarily know what our expectations of them are. And then they end up getting big labels attached to them, like defiance, right? Or aggression, refusal to follow directions, when really they're just in their safe space. Trauma impacts the brain, and we can see this sometimes through anxiety, restlessness, a lack of motivation, right? That's because it impacts that reward part of our brain. Memory problems, because if the amygdala is overworking, it cannot store memory. Irritability and anger, sadness, depression, and what's really, always hits a nerve for me is that trauma can impact the brain by limiting a youth's ability to experience joy. The things that maybe once they experienced joy through, they no longer do. And then trauma on the body. We know that many youth experience trauma and then it manifests in their body. They have headaches. They experience digestive disorders, respiratory disorders, muscle tension, altered vision and hearing, altered sleep or eating patterns. Some of the youth we work with experience that compulsiveness to self-harm and experience trauma so much so that they attempt to self-medicate with substances, right? Drugs and alcohol. And then we know that trauma shows up in behavior. We might see youth experience angry outbursts, avoidance of activities, right? The inability to process emotions through language. I will tell you that our language, our ability to process language is stored in the limbic system. So again, when we are in our survival brain, it's stored in our cortex. It's stored in our prefrontal cortex. So when we are in our survival brain, when we are in that fight, flight, or freeze, we're not able to access our language. Also, when we are in our limbic brain, when we are experiencing a big emotional outburst, we are also not able to access our language. And some of you may have experienced that as well, right? When you have heightened emotions, it can be really hard to find the words to use to explain how you're feeling. We also know that youth might have diminished range of emotions. They might have feelings of worthlessness, feelings of shame, and their trauma starts to take over as their core identity. That is how they start to identify. Now, I have to stress, and somebody already wrote this in the chat, but the importance of support, and specifically the outside support, you all in this session today. We all have an important role to play in providing stability and a safe space for children, and to be able to connect them with other caring adults. We can serve as a link to other services. We can serve to support with behavioral interventions to better meet the needs of youth who have experienced trauma. So just by being able to see their experience, to see who they are through a trauma-sensitive lens, is going to help us be a better support for our youth. And we talked about serotonin. Serotonin's on the bottom right, but I also just wanted to point out a couple other of what we call the happy chemicals in our brain. And really there's 4 of them. And this slide, and you all, just so you know, you all will have access to this slide deck later today. But there are ways that we can increase these happy chemicals in our brain. Oxytocin, which is what people call the love hormone. Playing with a pet actually increases our oxytocin. We get a rush of oxytocin, so we feel connection, we feel love. Giving another person a compliment, we do not do that enough. That gives us a rush of this love hormone. It makes us feel good about ourselves. Endorphins, right? This is what is the painkiller. Just by laughing increases our endorphins. Good sense, right? Aromatherapy, comedy. My personal favorite, chocolate, actually increases our endorphins, and exercise. Exercise increases our endorphins, right? Dopamine. Dopamine's that reward chemical. This is the chemical that when our reward system in our brain starts to become imbalanced, we need an increase of dopamine. Finishing a task gives us an increase of dopamine. I don't know about you, but I am a big list maker and I love crossing stuff off my list, and I get a little dopamine boost every time I do. Having self-care activities that you actually engage in, and celebrating accomplishments. And then, like I said, serotonin, which is that mood stabilizer. It helps us regulate our emotions. When I am working with a youth who is highly escalated, whether or not I know the youth or am close with them, I take them to a space, a safe space, ideally outside where we can walk in nature. It's a grounding exercise and it's really powerful. Now, of course, you have to know the circumstances to do that. I would not suggest everybody just take a kid out for a walk when they're escalated. But being in nature is really powerful for individuals when they are escalated. Meditation, swimming. I'm not a huge swimmer, but I'm sure it works for people. Yeah, and let me see who, so Dr. Crook put, ensuring trauma is addressed in the FBAs, which is super important. And oftentimes, because I do a lot of, an FBA, for anybody who's unaware, is a functional behavior assessment. I evaluate and analyze a lot of FBAs, and the biggest issue is when trauma is not addressed, right? Is when it's not spoken about. Because again, when youth are impacted by trauma, a traditional functional behavioral assessment is not going to be the only thing that can support them in the context of what we do for traditional behavioral interventions. It has to be looked at through a whole group, right? And we need to have some of that input to support the trauma that kid has experienced. Absolutely. And so we're going to move into really understanding what structure and predictability does to support brain development. And first, we have to consider high quality environments. And again, a couple of these slides may look similar if you have been in PDs of mine before, but it's really important to stress that we need to ensure our youth have environments that are safe, and that the physical spaces are clearly defined. The youth know where they have access to and where they do not have access to. There are environmental cues. There are visual tools for youth. There are schedules and routines that the youth know. There are good plans for transitions, so youth know what that looks like and it's not chaotic. And there's promotion of engagement, right? And of course, this is developmentally appropriate based on the age or the youth that you work with. But thinking about group activities, learning centers, one-on-one support. We need to have a variety of different opportunities for youth to engage with one another. And it has to be taught really well. We want to make sure we are creating an environment that supports all youth behaviorally. And I say this because all of the work that I'm talking about today, all of the interventions that we're addressing, it's just good practice for anybody. You do not have to work with youth impacted by trauma to do this work, right? We want to ensure that all of this is just part of our environment and our routine. When we set up a physical environment to monitor all youth and activities, this promotes feelings of safety. Our youth feel safe. And so we also need to consider traffic patterns. How do we develop a space to avoid disruption and to respect the personal space of others? What does this look like in your area, in your work environment? And we have to think about routines and procedures. Having routines is an intervention. It eliminates uncertainty, and it helps focus attention on more challenging activities. We do not want our youth to be worried about what routines are going to look like. We want them to worry about the other activities that they're going to engage in. We want to teach the behavior we want so that we reduce the behavior we don't want. And we want to connect behavior expectations to specific places, specific activities, specific needs of our youth. And when our youth are engaging in these routines and procedures appropriately, we want to reinforce that. We want to give them praise for that. And so here are some things to consider and remember about routines and procedures. We need them to be consistently implemented. If I am working in a building with youth, I want to make sure that my routines look similar to the other adult that's also supporting those youth. Youth impacted by trauma experience so much chaos in their world, in their life, that we want to reduce that chaos for them. We want these routines posted, clearly posted. We want to teach the behaviors that they need to know. When we provide routines, this supports brain development because youth know what to do. This reduces stress. It reduces cortisol development. It helps youth operate in a state of calm. It increases their serotonin. Having some understanding what to do when a behavior challenge occurs and having quick redirects helps reduce the impact of challenging behavior in your workspace. And routines also create the opportunity for intentional regulation strategies. When brains are developed under high traumatic situations or high stress situations, we need to teach coping skills. We need to teach regulation skills. So having routines is an easy way to add intentional regulation activities like deep breathing throughout the day or throughout the session you are with them. And structure and predictability, again, when you have well-organized routines and procedures, you model and you prompt organized behavior. We have to show and model what we expect from our youth. So think about the different procedures and how can we make these predictable? Youth impacted by trauma thrive from established expectations. They need boundaries. They actually want them, even if they push back on them. When we develop high expectations, it increases youth impacted by trauma to show them that they are capable and worthy. So it increases their own self-esteem. It also helps youth differentiate what are purposeful rules from unpredictable rules. And we know that they experience a lot of unpredictable rules in other areas of their life. We want our rules to be predictable and consistent. Consistent expectations create predictable adult behavior as well. So we want to make sure all adults in your work environment know what the expectations are so that their behavior is also predictable. And so I talk a lot about matrices, right? Of what the behavior should look like and what the expectation is. And we talk a lot about matrices in the context of a school space, but the truth is that matrices are great for any environment that youth are in. right? What does this look like for your workspace? Have you considered what this behavior is? Being explicit about what the behavior is that you are looking for is also being culturally responsive. Being on time, for example, is not a behavior that is looked for in all cultures. And so if that is an expectation that you have for the youth you work with, make sure that they know that. And then positive reinforcement. When we engage in positive reinforcement or acknowledgement, this is such a powerful tool for building self-esteem and building motivation for our youth. It teaches new skills and it increases their sense of self, their identity. We also want to make sure that if we have abstract concepts like time or noise level, that we make these concepts concrete. We have visuals, we have timers. Before moving into resiliency, are there any questions or thoughts about the structure and predictability pieces I just went over? And please feel free, you're welcome to use the hand raise emoji or plug something into the chat, or just go ahead and unmute yourself if you have any questions or comments. All right, I'm gonna move on, but please feel free if anything comes up. So we're gonna move into resiliency, because resiliency is a really important part of brain development. And resiliency is absolutely fascinating to me, because we know that we can work with two youth from the same household who have experienced the same exact trauma and situation and environment, and they have a varying degrees of resiliency for themselves, right? Their behaviors are completely different. The way that they've internalized their trauma is completely different. And a lot of this comes down to resiliency. So there are some skills of resiliency to consider when we are thinking about the youth that we work with. So resiliency refers to a set of skills and characteristics that allows individuals to adjust and cope effectively with different challenges that life presents us. So some of these resiliency skills are being proactive, self-regulation, having connections and attachments, gaining achievements, having community, and having proactive parenting, which essentially is when parents model and provide guidance for their youth. So what this is saying is that when a youth has engagement in these areas, the likelihood of them having resiliency is going to be higher. And we want to be clear that resilience is not all or nothing. It's a spectrum. You can be a little resilient. You can be a lot resilient. You can be resilient in some situations and not in others. But the most important thing is that resiliency can be taught. We can teach resiliency. We can go over these different resiliency skills like self-regulation and teach self-regulation. We can help our youth connect and make friends with each other. We can acknowledge so our youth experience achievement, experience praise. We can build community, right? All of these are ways that we can continue to promote and build resiliency for the youth that we work with. This impacts the brain. They start to get that rush of some of those healthy brain chemicals, which is going to decrease the stress chemicals in our brain. So some of the research, and this dates back from 2011, but analysis of just over 270,000 students shows that students found to possess resilience demonstrated improved social and emotional skills, attitudes towards others, behavior towards others, and improved academic gain, up to 11 percentile point achievement gain. And we know about the achievement gain as well. The achievement gain aligns a lot with those social and emotional skills as well. We also know that resilient children are less likely to become depressed, less likely to become helpless. They're more likely to be able to persist in problem solving. They have a growth mindset. They want to take risks. They want to reach milestones and work for the milestones. And part of this resiliency is about protective factors. And when I talk about protective factors, I'm talking about characteristics associated with a lower likelihood of negative outcomes, or characteristics that reduce a risk factor's impact. So protective factors are often seen as positive countering events. Protective factors are people, routines, relationships, boundaries, and new behaviors that we begin to employ. This is going to reduce the likelihood of negative life outcomes for our youth. So you all in this session tonight are protective factors for youth. Other examples of protective factors. We have internal protective factors. People who are more optimistic. Optimism is a protective factor. Having emotional awareness about ourselves, having flexible thinking, self-efficacy, believing you can do it, pushing through, having empathy. And then some environmental protective factors. When youth have a meaningful connection to an adult, that is a protective factor. That is all of you in this session tonight. When youth have realistically high expectations, that is a protective factor because they set goals for themselves and they reach those goals. And clear boundaries. Clear boundaries is critical for adults working with youth, especially youth impacted by trauma. I'm not going to go through this, but you will have access to this by the end of the evening. Some examples of risk factors and protective factors. And just as a reminder of where these protective factors can be found. So I'm going to go over some other ways that we can support building resiliency for the youth that we work with. And some of it has to do with avoid accommodating every need for them. We want to try not to be too overprotective because we want them to solve problems. We want to avoid eliminating all risk. It's important for youth to, age appropriately face some risks, right? And then we can teach them skills to help them learn their limits. We want to teach how to problem solve. Sometimes we need to teach concrete skills, specific skills that they need to learn to handle specific situations. And it's important to avoid why questions sometimes when building resiliency so that we can move and shift to how questions instead. How questions help promote problem solving. We want to avoid providing all the answers, and this can be challenging because sometimes it's so much easier to just provide the answer, but that is not building resiliency. We also want to avoid talking in catastrophic terms. So pay attention to what you say to the youth that you work with. and help them manage their emotions. Emotional regulation is key in resilience. It's also okay to feel all the emotions, right? That's okay. But just processing is what's really important, and modeling resiliency. Sometimes we make mistakes and it's okay, and we have to admit it, right? Sometimes we make mistakes with the way that we handle the situation with a youth that we work with. And that happens. That's okay. We are human. So we apologize and we move on. I have done that many times with the youth that live with me and youth that I work with. And I apologize to them to show them that, hey, I made a mistake. I jumped to a conclusion and I should not have. Let's talk about how I could have handled that differently in the future, right? Apologizing is powerful. We also want to help our youth by teaching them how to make connections. And somebody wrote in the chat earlier, right? Youth are feeling more and more isolated than ever before. The COVID pandemic is not helping with that. We actually might have to teach how to make connections, teach that social engagement. Give the youth opportunities to help other people. Give youth the opportunity to problem solve with another youth. When I work with youth in detention centers, in juvenile prisons, this is so powerful to help the youth together problem solve with each other. A situation, a frustration. With my facilitation, getting them to talk through it. Daily routines, self-care, right? We need to teach our youth about self-care. What does that look like? What does that mean to them? And some other examples of what this looks like, right? There's so many opportunities for building resiliency. Not all of these are going to work with every single youth that you work with, right? We have to pick and choose based on the need and the skill set of the youth we are working with. And this is some of the differences, and this is not an exhaustive list. This is a generalized of what it looks like when we are working with resilient youth and then non-resilient youth. When we work with youth who are resilient, they are capable of coping with change. It might still feel icky to them, but they can work through it. They recover more easily after challenges. They can be resourceful. They can be successful, well-liked. They have an increase of confidence. They can demonstrate self-control. When we work with youth who are experiencing non-resilience, and I say experiencing it because resilience is on a spectrum, they might appear more rigid or inflexible, have academic difficulties, less likely to reach goals or even set goals. They might have difficulty connecting to their peers and have lower self-esteem, right? These are some cues that we might need to support building resiliency in the youth that we are working with. And we have to consider our own resilience, right? It's important for us to think about, what does this look like for us? Because if we are protective factors for the youth that we work with, in order to maximize the opportunity for us to build and support that brain development, we have to understand our own resilience and what we need to do for ourselves. So we have to consider, how do we validate ourselves? How do we validate other people? When do we give compliments? When was the last time you received a compliment? And I'm talking about like a meaningful compliment. When you are having a hard time, when you are feeling stuck in work maybe with a particular youth you are supporting. What do you do to slow yourself down and process? Who do you lean on? Do you listen to youth rather than judging them? And if you are finding yourself judging more, it might mean you need to engage in some more resiliency practices. How do you celebrate? How do you celebrate your own accomplishments? And in your work setting, how can you sustain engagement? The most recent survey that was just released today, and this is about teachers in particular, is that like 50% of teachers in the country right now are looking for new jobs, are wanting to leave the field. That is not sustaining much engagement within a particular work system. So what about in your work systems? What about with the work environment that you are a part of? How do you sustain engagement? How do you talk to your colleagues about trauma-informed supports for youth, about looking at youth through a trauma-sensitive lens? And just as a reminder, right, there is no simple process for the work that you all do. Caring for ourselves while we care for youth, care for students, it's hard, it's challenging. Being a protective factor for our youth, right, that's big. That we can be, we could be, we are the adult that is helping the youth that we work with build resiliency. Are there any questions about any of the information I've gone over tonight? All right, well, thank you all so much for being here. Again, my name is Tovah, and this is my information. And if anything comes to you, if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out. I am more than happy to answer questions. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, can I just say I loved your presentation, and not only will I take it to share when I'm doing our crisis intervention classes, but I am a parent and a scout leader, and this is fabulously informing. And did you say that it will be, that this is recorded so that other people can view it also?
Yes, so I will, if you plug your email into the chat for me, I will definitely get you the recording. And actually, before I forget, I'm going to put the PDF slides in for you as well.
And is it okay for me to share this personally? I mean, to
Yes.
parents that
Yes.
and teachers and friends and
yeah, as long as my name's
sure?
on it. Yeah, no,
okay.
my information is on there, so absolutely.
Yeah, that's why I wasn't sure if you did,
I am not
classes or.
I do classes all the time, and I am not a gatekeeper of this information. I want this as a resource for people. I want this information out there because we are in the business of supporting youth and protecting youth. So absolutely.
Well, I appreciate it. It was a great class, and we even just in our I am assistant scout leader in a girl and a boy troop, and just the changes that we've seen in some individuals through COVID, and with friends, their experiences with their children, and teachers trying to connect. And this is really, really helpful. I appreciate you doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you, Tovah. I have to say,
course.
this is the second training, and I actually do enjoy. Like, I look forward to your training because this is the first time I'm pretty knowledgeable of trauma, and that's always that's my passion also, and I try to push that. And when I go to different schools, but like you always say, one key thing that makes me, change my own practice. You know what I mean? So that to me, that's really enlightening for my own professional growth. Like last.
Oops, you muted yourself.
How like SEL and trauma like is the same, like, you know what I mean? And so like really we should be more creating trauma safe spaces and trauma informed practices to really hit all our kids versus just SEL curriculum.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should tell you too, I'm working really closely with Lincoln High School right now.
Yeah, I heard that.
Okay, and all the work that I'm doing, it's through this work. It's through Pierce County. So I guess I shouldn't be, I'm going to stop recording. But